Okay, so could we have a hand, please, for Ian, that's done so much for this movement. Writer of two books. We've got the latest book at the back there, the 9/11, The New Evidence. One of his books was serialised in the Daily Mail, so Ian really has taken this information into the foreground. I think I've said everything else, except Ian wants me to remind you about the T-shirts. Please buy a T-shirt. Are you going to use this?
Whichever one works better, I guess. Yeah, guys. I mean, I wore this T-shirt to the Notting Hill Carnival, and you know, I probably got the best exposure for 9/11 truth you can get. You know, I must have reached hundreds and hundreds of people. So it is worth getting a T-shirt.
Sorry, do you prefer this microphone, or should I use this one or that one?
Your one.
Didn't sound very well, did it? So you know that you do have a big effect if you do get a T-shirt. We've got them going cheap, and there's a collector's issue Deception dollar for everybody who buys a T-shirt. It was brought out in about 2003. It's a work of art. It's now treated as a work of art, the Deception dollar. If you don't know what I mean, I don't blame you for being a bit mystified, but you can have a look at them at Teddy's bookstore after this. Well, I'd just like to say thanks very much to Noel and Fran for organising this. I think it was mainly Noel and Fran, Rob, Roy, and I'm so glad that I didn't have to organise it. It's just so pleasurable coming to a meeting where you're not responsible for anything except your speech. And with no adrenaline from organising it, I hope my speech is going to, not just sort of wander around for too long without getting anywhere. One question I get asked always is, well, what's new in 9/11? So just for the sort of detail, the people who like to pay attention to detail, I'll just run through a few little things. Many people here might have heard these already. They're all new to me in the last year. That the fire alarm at World Trade Center 7 was switched off at 7:15 that morning. And there's a guy doing a lot of research into this, into the very boring details of the fire alarm system in World Trade Center 7. But of course it also goes on to the point of what did happen to the people who were working there. Surely there must be a whistleblower. I'm just pointing out an area of research that I don't think has been done or I'm not aware of. So out of the thousands of people who worked in Building 7, you'd think that, we'd like to hear what they've got to say, wouldn't we, as to what happened that morning. Were they sent home? Were they told not to come in? We just don't know. Well, I don't know anyway. It turned out also that the NIST report, the absurd NIST report into World Trade Center 7 had not been peer-reviewed. So really that's all you need to know about it. Not peer-reviewed equals not scientific, end of, basically. It doesn't disprove it, but they can't say they've proven anything. The consensus panel, the 9/11 consensus panel, that's an interesting development. They're getting a lot of credibility, they're getting stuff published in the Wall Street Journal, and they just got a bunch of experts, admittedly, they're all 9/11 skeptics, but they are all experts with standing, and they're discussing what they think we can actually definitely say for 100% certain, and what we can't, and they want to emphasise the things that we can actually definitely say for 100% certain. And one of the points that they've made, which is something that Roland Morgan and I went into in our book, has never really been taken up by a lot of the 9/11 truth community, and that is the question of how the hijackers could have taken over the planes without any alarm calls being made by any of the pilots, most of whom were military trained, which in itself is an interesting point. So, the consensus panel is saying this story about the phone calls, it just doesn't work. You've got one person saying, well, I heard the call and I looked at the time and it was 9:03. Well, at 9:03, there was somebody who was having their throat slit next to them, but they were having made quite a calm call. You've got these sort of crazy contradictions in the official story about the phone calls, which can't really be ironed out at all easily. So that's the phone calls and the takeover of the planes. I found out for the first time that there had been extensive work on renewing the lifts on the two World Trade Center buildings. A lot of people say, well, if you're saying that they were brought down with explosives, how could they have got them in? Well, most of us probably know about the power downs in the buildings in the weeks before, but that wouldn't have been enough to do such a thorough job as appears to have been done. Well, there was extensive work on the lifts, renewing the lift shafts, and of course the lift shafts ran quite close to the central core. Anyway, it's just a research tip. I'm not saying there's anything, too world-shattering about any of these points. It's just bits of a jigsaw, really. The Victorians had a saying, "Oh, what tangled webs we weave when we practice to deceive." And so we got their web that they wove is becoming increasingly tangled as time goes on. And a story that was perfectly good enough to persuade the public with the help of the US media 12 years ago when it happened and everybody was in a state of shock is not at all any good at standing the test of time. And they're sort of desperate that we forget about 9/11, I think, now. Especially now that they've become Al-Qaeda's air force in Syria, as a lot of people would say. There's been a bit of court testimony come out to show that the National Security Agency phone tapping program started not after 9/11, as the Washington media tell us, but before 9/11. That's come out in fairly recently released court testimony from one of the chief of one of the companies who was asked to participate in the phone tapping. He refused, and his life was ruined from then on. He ended up in a court case. I think he went to jail. Very senior guy. He just said, well, we don't want to do this phone tapping because our general counsel tells us it's illegal and we can't do things that are illegal. It wasn't good enough for them. All the others agreed. And this is before 9/11. Now quite an important development on the sort of war of ideas, intellectual level. Lance DeHaven Smith. He's the American academic who created the concepts of state and corporate crimes against democracy, SCADs. You may remember that the Journal of American Behavioral Science gave a special issue to how the public are persuaded of these criminal acts or anything other than, criminal acts. And Lance DeHaven Smith has now brought out a book. I think it's called something like 9/11 in the Academy, but you can easily search his name, Lance DeHaven Smith. Heavyweight academic, and he's analysed the concept of a conspiracy theory and how prior to the Kennedy assassination it appears rarely in American media and in American public discourse, but when it does appear, the presumption is usually that the conspiracy theory is true, because America, after all, has a tradition of disbelieving politicians. The great achievement of the CIA in the last 20 or 30 years has been to create the concept conspiracy theory and to persuade people that if it's a conspiracy theory, it's not true. That is a magnificent work of sociological and psychological sensitivity and control. It helps, of course, if you control the media through ownership, but nonetheless, it was quite a lot of work for them, and it is a CIA concept. So any sort of smart-ass, sort of so-called left-wing journalist or right-wing, any journalist that you meet who starts sneering about conspiracy theories, they might not believe it, but you can take comfort in the fact that they are actually a dupe of the CIA. So I think that's quite important. And these sort of books do start having effect academically. If you've got a bit of academic authority for what you're saying, then other academics will listen and a book, by an eminent social scientist is that authority. On the question of the police commander, Matt gave us a very good report of it. I would just add one thing. I was at the meeting as well, and what we tried to explain to the police commander is that this is a standard ongoing conspiracy, and what they do is they fake the information so as to get their war going. And in a sense, we know that there is that conspiracy because it happened with Iraq, with the invasion of Iraq. They faked the intelligence to get the war going. They inserted a lie into the discourse, which shifted the discourse in the direction they needed. And of course, that's exactly what happened with 9/11. A lie was inserted into the political discourse that we are now vulnerable to devastating surprise attacks by quite ordinary people in Afghanistan. That's how dangerous our world is. That was the lie that they introduced into the political discourse. We are under attack, as Goebbels or Goering said. They inserted that lie, we're under attack. And they did it in almost exactly the same way. They set up an office of special plans, and that office was almost certainly liaising undercover with the CIA, just as we know they did now for the Iraq War. And for a policeman, they can understand that. Modus operandi is something that police look at and they take as important evidence. as to whether they're onto a real conspiracy or they're just imagining things. And if they want to identify, for instance, a criminal gang, you know, they will look at the modus operandi. And so we had what, for a policeman, is a very simple story. There's a criminal gang, this is their modus operandi, and this is how they operate. They take control of the governments, they close down the legitimate law enforcement operations, and as you know, our friend was saying, they've done that pretty thoroughly in America. I wouldn't necessarily agree that they've done it 100%, but who knows? And that is their modus. So you know that did seem to get a little bit of traction with the police commander. Well, you know, we've got Syria. There is a lot of public scepticism about Syria, but I think, you know, really as truthers, as skeptics about the media, I think the good news is when we hear people saying, I don't believe this story about chemical weapons. I don't believe that it was Assad. I think that that's at least unproven and most likely untrue. Putin said it. We never heard Putin say 9/11 was an inside job, but we have had him say that this is a inside job type thing. So, you know, it's not a difficult point to push in today's political climate, but of course the BBC will be doing all it can to eliminate that view. They will be wanting to make it look about as if, you know, are we right to use violence to deal with this fake event, or should we just do it diplomatically? And we're going to get, you know, those debates. And I imagine what they're going to try and do is to get it into the United Nations and then gradually browbeat the Russians and the Chinese into agreeing some tiny little fig leaf, which they will then say authorises the use of force. I'm sorry to say that although I'm as pleased as everybody, you know, that the Syrian attack hasn't gone ahead straight away, I don't think at all we should let down our guard. You know, there was a moment like this about 6 months before the Iraq attack, when it looked like they were going to attack. They didn't, and we all felt so grateful that we trusted Tony Blair. Well, some people trusted Tony Blair, you know, to get us out of the trouble in the UN, and of course it got us into the trouble. So let's not, you know, totally feel that we've won on Syria. It would be the first time for many, many years that the Israel lobby would have been defeated, if we have one. And they go down. I mean, already they've started attacking Miliband for apparently quite unrelated things. They're not going to attack him for doing something that was extremely popular. So of course they're going to attack him for something to do with the trade unions or something. You know, you can see how the sort of controllers plan it and operate it. It's pretty transparent once you realise that there are controllers at the BBC, you know, who have to operate editorial policy and have editorial control. So I think that's one important point about Syria. But another point is just what a disaster their rationale is, their sort of narrative is. You know, first of all, we were in bed with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Then, according to them, Al-Qaeda attacked us in New York in the 9/11 attacks, and they promised they would never have anything to do with Al-Qaeda again. And now here they are back in bed with Al-Qaeda. So, you know, how ridiculous is that? And how many of the public do they think they can defy and just appeal to the people with no memories, people who don't remember any of that? And it looks at the moment as if, you know, they're not getting away with it, but it'll be a close run thing, in my opinion. But there are other things as well, of course, apart from this, which lead us to, well, which make them really, where they're saying we don't really believe the 9/11 story. That's why we're in bed with Al-Qaeda in Syria. If we really believed the 9/11 story, we wouldn't be in bed with Al. Of course we wouldn't, not 10 years after they killed 3,000 people, and there's no reason to be involved in Syria at all. But, you know, no safety review of buildings, no substantial review of building safety after 9/11, no major new changes. As far as I'm aware, not one building in the world has had any changes made to it as a result of the apparent, you know, huge shock of 9/11, when we found out that apparently skyscrapers can just collapse like a pack of cards. I mean, that's new. You know, nobody thought that could happen before 9/11. Now they're all saying, well, it must have happened. It happened, so it happened. You know, so that they're having to change their theories a bit, and not doing a very good job of it. But the point is, you know, why hasn't anything else changed? Because it bloody well should have done. And then, of course, recently we had this farcical little incident of the knives on planes. you know, presumably thinking to themselves, well, you know, everybody's forgotten about 9/11 now, you know, let's get rid of this ridiculous rule that you can't take a knife on the plane. Because this was the story, if you remember, in 9/11, how they took over the planes by using simple little knives, basically, and managed to overcome, you know, 8 mostly army-trained pilots who didn't even manage to get one hijack alarm off, and it was all because they had the brilliant idea of smuggling knives onto the planes. So obviously, if you believe that story, you've got to ban knives on planes, and they did do. And then just quietly last year, they said, no, okay, we'll change the rules, you can have a knife. Well, they forgot about the knife, and this is the problem with the weave, you know, the webs that they weave, the tangled webs, because by now there were a whole lot of 9/11 survivor victims, relatives and people, and they were all said, well, hang on, you know, that people taking knives on planes is what led to all our relatives dying. You know, surely you're not going to allow it again now. And there was a huge kerfuffle. And having gone public and everybody seeing what they were doing, they rescinded the rule. So you're still not allowed to take knives on planes in America, as far as that's my reading of it. That's about it, really. Very happy to. Yeah, the Kuala Lumpur. I think I was just thought I'd mention a few things that other people didn't mention. So it's been a little bit of a hodgepodge. And that's about it, really, unless anybody's got any questions.
A few comments on Syria. I mean, Assad's in a much stronger position than, say, Saddam's. Firstly, China and Russia have regrouped. They're much stronger now, and they're allied to him. And also he's got Iran on his side, which is military is quite strong. And also, if the West was so foolish to attack Syria, he's got lots of proxies, like Hezbollah have got enormous missiles. They can attack Israel. And apparently they can... Hezbollah's got missiles to actually attack the cruise ships which are firing, so he's got a lot stronger ally. And also the Saudi oil fields are in East Saudi Arabia where the Shia Muslims are, and apparently they could blow, or their ally to us said they could blow the oil fields. I mean, I don't know if you saw George Galloway on Russia's Day at 3 o'clock last Saturday. I mean, if they were to attack Syria, the whole Middle East would go up in flames. And if they were forced to invade it, Iran obviously would send its revolutionary guards in. So I think it's quite possible that they would actually be beaten in the war, because they're not just taking on Assad's army, but they're also taking on Iran and backed up by Russian missiles. So I think like the Western imperialist camp are in a much weaker position now than they were 11
Well, it's definitely the big one, isn't it? And I mean, one thought I've had is that one reason why I think the politicians are rebelling, it's just pure conjecture this, but I suspect that, I mean, why go to the trouble of having yet another pretext to start attacking Iran? I think this is the big one now.
Yeah.
I think if they've figured out that if they can once get a really good war going against Syria, then they should be able to bring in Iran without having to get anybody's permission.
Well, come back here. The chief of staff of the Chinese army says if the Western armies invaded Iran, China would come to its aid, sending troops, and it would lead to the start of World War III. Because that's what he actually definitely said that. So,
on the other hand, I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong, but on the other hand, you know that you can get favourable quotes from people in the BBC. Quite often quotes the Russians as saying, "Well, actually, we're not going to bother about this," and you know, I mean, you can't believe anything, really, can you?
Well, just to quickly to follow on with that, this is the first post-economic collapse where there hasn't been a world war engineered to solve, in inverted commas, the problem. In other words, kill millions of people and rejig the economy. And to one of your main arguments, the same thing of nothing having happened is true of what's going on in the financial sector. Nothing has happened. I've been reading Adam Hilton in the Evening Standard and on City AM, the Alison Heath. Their comments I find extremely informative. So we're in a situation where there could be World War III, and the monetary system is just being stitched up for the 0.01% who are going to get larger a bit, but only by 0.1%. And we are being run by a bunch of pathogens.
It's all the money. It's for them. It's the
yes,
money.
Yes, it's money which is the poison which is destroying us.
I've actually been approached. I think I should probably just mention this publicly. I've been approached by somebody who was staying with a relative of the Silversteins in New York on the morning of 9/11, and she says that they had a phone call and they were told to get out of New York. They had a phone call at 8 o'clock and they rushed out of New York. I can't get her to go public. She could be some sort of a hoaxer, but actually I don't think she is, after having thought about it for quite a long time. So I mean, I think that's an illustration of how many potential time bombs there are for the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, basically, because there are so many whistleblowers. I mean, I'm losing track how many whistleblowers there are from the FBI, from the NSA. They only ever give a little bit, because of course these organisations are compartmentalised, so nobody's going to be able to talk about anything more than what that was on their desk. But they're all extra bits of the jigsaw, and while they're, to mix a metaphor, while their web's getting more and more tangled, our jigsaw puzzle is going quite nicely. We're accumulating the pieces, and they're beginning to fit together quite neatly, although there's still a lot we don't know. Any other questions?
Regarding the Syrian business, there's extremely credible group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, including ex-CIA, ex-DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and FBI. They're saying that their colleagues who are still serving are telling them that all the evidence is pointing to these chemical weapons being used by the opposition. They say not only that, but a week before the 21st incident, which is the one that caused all this trouble, the American advisors in Turkey were telling their mercenary cannibal terrorists, ACA rebels, to be ready to march on Damascus, because there was going to be a war-changing event which would lead within a few days to America bombing Assad's forces, and they should be ready to march on Damascus. Now, this group sent a memo to Obama, public memo, and they also had sent one to George W. Bush, saying the same thing about the weapons of mass destruction information, so-called intelligence. He of course took no notice, and Obama has taken no notice. There's one more thing, if anyone looks that up, just look up Obama warned on Syrian intel, and that information comes up. I'll make it brief as well. The other point is that it appears that Syria is going to hand over prepared to hand over their chemical weapons. Some people might think, oh, that's great. But it's not really great, because that is their strategic defence. And when Saddam Hussein destroyed his weapons, or got rid of them, he was attacked. When Libya had got rid of most of theirs, they were attacked. So Syria not only would present itself as a target, a future easy target for attack, but it also stops it from being a disincentive for anyone to attack Iran, because they have a joint pact with each other, and of course the Syrian chemical weapons are extremely important in regard to being a deterrent against that attack.
Paul, could you have you wrapped up now? We value your words in such a long time. You've finished, good. So we've got two other questions, and if we'll take those together, we'll roll them together, because we have got another speaker lined up.
Okay. I've never spoken to him too much.
I heard that has anyone heard about the National Service Bill
2013 to 2014. That's I'm really sketchy on the details, I have to admit, but it's just something that has come to my attention recently.
America or UK?
UK.
I was an MP for Kettering. It's a private men's field.
Yeah, it's a
private men's field.
Yeah. But I don't really even know what that means.
It means that it's unlikely to get through unless the government wants it, but it could be an attempt to start to manipulate public opinion to get the idea of conscription back into the sort of public consciousness. I suspect there. Paul, I don't disagree with anything you've said. I always assumed that Syria's chemical weapons were sort of to balance Israel's nuclear weapons, and it's a sort of there's a one-sided disarmament being proposed. But let's see what happens in the UN, and let's see what happens when all those congressmen have been in Washington for a few weeks. I mean, let's remember that they were rebellious after the summer. After a few weeks of bribery and corruption in Washington, they might start changing their votes, especially if Obama can present some new rationale or say that something's changed. So we definitely need to keep the pressure up, I would have said. Just finally, I'd just like to mention what I'm doing now, which is RAD TV. And if anybody knows anybody who wants to take part, you can find out what we're doing by going onto YouTube and searching for RAD TV UK. That we're sort of recognised, that search is recognised now. I think Google would find it as well. And you get straight to the page where all the various RAD TV news clips. The idea, and we have got a little bit of interest from people with money in this, the idea is that we become not a broadcaster, which is hugely onerous because you've got to fill airwaves, or even a big website's very onerous, but just we do, an hour a week, a programme for an hour a week, and then hopefully sell it to third world broadcasters. Yesterday I was interviewed by Islam Radio in South Africa, and they always interview me every 9/11, and I always tell them the same thing, that it was an inside job, probably, and but they actually go out to millions of people across Africa. We haven't heard of them. They're outside the NATO area, they're not in the sort of kosher sort of media, but there's a lot of broadcasters, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa. There's a lot of broadcasters who don't want to have to use American supplied product for their programs, but they don't have any choice because you can't make your own programs all day long. It's much too expensive, so you have to buy them in. And the only people offering you stuff to buy in are basically Associated Press with their organised, system of essentially propaganda. Or you could go to Russia Today. You could probably syndicate them now. But we're hoping to be a little bit more in between, a little bit more English, and use the English brand a bit to sell it, and just be sort of a little bit more measured, not as angry as Alex Jones, more sort of a little bit of humour. That's the idea with RAD TV. So do have a look, tell your friends about it, and if you know anybody who wants to participate as a correspondent, obviously we can't just take anybody, but somebody might want to do a bit of research. You don't have to be that knowledgeable about something to be a correspondent. You just have to be able to process information in the right way, or presenting, or maybe a bit of help even with editing. Just get in touch. It's not difficult. Just email me. Find an email. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Ian Henshall, and we have got one of Ian's books at the back.